There's a certain romance to horror. The suspense, the dread, the monsters in the shadows. I've always loved it. The classics, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Wolfman, those old Universal monster films were my gateway. Creatures stitched together in castles, rising from tombs, snarling beneath full moons. Then of course a horror like Friday the 13th came along and kicked the doors off, bringing the era of masked killers, screaming teens and buckets of blood. And it didn't stop there. My love for horror grew. From the VHS nasties of the 80s to modern gems like Heretic. My wife is just obsessed with it all, which means you might be seeing us play a horror game together in a future video. Consider that a warning, or a promise. Before we dive in, I want you to do something fun and different for this video. I've hidden 3 rare peppers, not including the one you're seeing on screen. This is just an example of what to look out for. If you find all 3 and comment the timestamps, I'll give you a shout out in the next Pepptrospective video. Think of it as a haunted Easter egg hunt, just no chocolate and more monsters. The late 90s was a fascinating time for horror games. You had Resident Evil, of course, the big one, redefining survival horror, and plenty of others trying to find their angle, but Nightmare Creatures was a bit of an oddity. It wasn't about puzzles or fixed camera angles, it was fast, brutal and grotesque. And unlike a lot of its peers, it felt closer to old horror films, cobblestones, fog and torches. It was less Hollywood, more hammer horror, just with a higher body count and fewer polite accents. Nightmare Creatures takes place in 1834, being set in a grimy, plague-ridden version of London. A secret cult has been meddling with alchemy, and the result? An army of hideous mutants tearing through the city.
Fate led him along another path, towards black magic. Now he is in possession of the mythical Lost Diary of Samuel Pepys, a volume that contains the detestable rituals of the demon-worshipping Brotherhood of Hecate. Soon, he will complete his work. Tonight, as the sun sets on London one last time, he will unleash his demonic brood onto the streets. And should no one stop him, this city will be consumed by a horde of nightmare creatures.
You play as either Ignatius, a name I really can't pronounce, who is a staff-wielding monk with a grim sense of duty. The staff has a solid reach and deals a good bit of damage. However, if a staff-wielding monk isn't to your taste, there is Nadia, the daughter of a murdered scientist who is no stranger to spinning heel kicks, swordplay or righteous vengeance. Nadia's sword is quicker and the right character for dodging a flurry of attacks. Whilst your main weapons, the sword or staff, handle most of the fighting, Nightmare Creatures throws a decent mix of sub-weapons and power-ups to shake things up. Personally, I tend to rely on the pistol, the multi-gun, dynamite and the berserker power-up. You also need to find health, because health is quite scarce. There's going to be red vials and yellow vials that give you either full health or a little bit of health. Health is very vital in this game and you do take quite a lot of damage, so looking out for this kind of item is essential. You can find these items hidden in walls or in secret areas, so you always need to be on the lookout. This is where you're going to also find your sub-weapons. Especially the one that you need to look out for is ammo for your pistol because it's helpful for long range attacks, but also the item, the berserker power up. The item will then turn your sword into a saw, or if you're using a staff, it will turn it into like a saw staff. This is really good and vital for dismantling enemies because enemies have dismantling parts, so you can slice them in half, take away their limbs. It's a very interesting gameplay mechanic. But it's also not essential to beat the game with these sub-weapons. It will just make the game that little bit easier because at times it does get very brutal and health is very, very rare like I mentioned before. Nightmare Creatures often gets labelled as a survival horror, but I never really bought into that label. Yes, it is grim and it is gory, and yes, there are monsters galore at its core. This is more of an action game. It's relentless, scrappy, and it's almost like a beat 'em up style of brawler that doesn't lean too much into the genre as hard as Fighting Force did around the same time, but there's definitely some shared DNA. And whilst it doesn't have the locked doors and elaborate puzzles you'll find in Resident Evil, it's also not completely linear. The levels aren't corridors on rails, but they're not as open-ended or abstract enough like Silent Hill either. You're often going to find enough room to explore, to sniff out secrets and hunt down health, maybe get lost for a moment, but never so much that it drags on or overstays its welcome. That said, the level layouts can occasionally throw you off. It's not always clear where you need to go next, especially when the fog sets or the gates are tucked around a corner behind a stack of crates. And when you're low on health and the adrenaline meter is starting to dip, that moment of disorientation suddenly feels like more urgent. You don't want to find the next fight, you need to find the next fight to survive. The enemy AI is surprisingly sharp. They dodge, they flank, they wait for openings. Like they've been watching you train from behind the fog. One-on-one is intense enough, but get surrounded and it's panic mode. You're not just mashing buttons, you're surviving and mauling. But the real kicker, the adrenaline system. Stop fighting for too long and your heart gives out. The enemies and bosses and nightmare creatures feel like something ripped straight out of Frankenstein's nightmare. They're stitched together, grotesque and unpredictable. From shambling zombies and snarling werewolves to bizarre mutants and demonic creatures, the game throws a diverse and memorable roster at you. Fun fact, if you dive into the debug menu, you can play through most of the game as one of the monsters, but each of the boss fights force you to switch back to play one of the main characters. No monster mischief allowed when it really counts. Speaking of bosses, they can be a bit of a mixed bag. Crowley, however, the final boss, is especially cheap. He blocks as many of your basic combos as possible, making it a real slog to land hits. You'll probably die a bunch of times unless you can maneuver him into a cheese spot, where the game quirks lets you rack up some cheap damage for yourself. It's frustrating, but it adds a certain gritty challenge to the finale. One thing Nightmare Creatures really nails is the atmosphere. It leans heavily into gothic horror and it absolutely looks the part. From the colour palette to the environments, it's all damp cobblestones and flickering torchlight and crumbling brick. The music never overdoes it, but it lingers, just enough to make everything feel uneasy. You get your classic horror locations like cemeteries and crypts, but most of the time you're out in the open, winding through city streets, abandoned docks, scorched graveyards. And because the entire game takes place at night, there's this constant mood of decay and dread hanging over everything. It's not flashy, but it's incredibly effective. Nightmare Creatures didn't reach the heights of Resident Evil or Silent Hill, at least in the public consciousness. It got decent reviews and sold well enough, and even spawned a sequel, but when people talk about PlayStation horror, it's often an afterthought. And that's a shame, because in terms of design, tone and sheer ambition, it holds its own. The variety on offer here, in enemies, locations and mechanics is impressive for a PS1 N64 era game. You're dropped into a world where monsters are made, not born, and you feel that. Every grotesque creation feels like the result of some horrific experiment, rather than just a generic creature number 6. What stuck with me all these years is the feel of Nightmare Creatures. That gothic grit, the tension of the combat, the horror of the turning the corner and finding something you're absolutely not ready for. This game actually came before Silent Hill, but it never quite got the same love or attention. The iconic fog? It's a classic horror trope and it works brilliantly here, thickening the atmosphere and hiding threats just out of sight. Combined with the variety of monsters and fast-paced gameplay, it's a standout title in the PS1 era. I first found Nightmare Creatures on a demo disc when I was 6 years old, and I played it to death. And yes, it scared the life out of me, but I kept coming back, over and over until I got the full game. I just never managed to beat it as a kid, but now, I can proudly say that this one is a childhood ghost laid to rest. It's tough, even on easy mode, and yeah, that difficulty can sometimes overshadow the fun, but it's part of what makes the experience so rewarding. You die, you restart, you learn the combos, you fight to get better, and when you finally win, it feels well earned. Sure, it can be a bit clunky compared to today's horror games, but Nightmare Creatures has aged surprisingly well. For me, it's the horror title from that era that's left the most lasting impression, and despite my love for the original Resident Evils, this one stands out for how much it stuck with me. It's left a lasting thought in my head of just how interesting and different the game was. It was that more fast-paced action, the variety in monsters, and I think the sheer difficulty just makes me think that, yeah, this one is very, very overshadowed. So if you're after a challenge and a dive into some solid gothic horror, I definitely recommend giving Nightmare Creatures a go. It's a worthwhile adventure, unsettling, relentless, and generally memorable. Honestly, this has been one of the most fun videos I've made. Revisiting this strange, violent world and digging into its weird lore, dying just as many times as I did about 15 years ago. It's been a joy. Thanks for watching, and hey, if you spotted all 3 peppers hidden in this video, make sure you drop a comment below if you want a shout out in the next Pepptrospective. Also, let me know your favourite horror game from the PS1 and N64 era, and whether you think it still holds up today. If I haven't played it, I may check it out in a future video, or get my wife to. Remember, keep it Pepptro.